Welcome to the Good and Basic Podcast, a long-form conversation between Joseph and Joseph about the projects we do on our YouTube channel, why we do them, and miscellaneous other philosophical sundries. So,
I like that, philosophical sundries.
Philosophical sundries.
That to me describes it really well.
It's like the philosophy you scrape off the bottom of
oh my goodness. It describes to me both the kind of the flavor and the variety.
Yeah.
You can find our social media information in the video description / show notes below, as well as a link to our website that we just launched, which has a variety of stuff, including a donation service if you'd like to support us. So thank you very much. That's actually partially what we wanted to talk about today. I'm not sure. Do you want to set this up, or do you want me to set this up, or shall we both set this up?
Well, let's both do it. I'm going to start.
Okay, all right. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the themes that we talk about a fair amount, it's been hinted at in a number of videos. I did one on why make things from scratch, where I talked about the virtue of independence. And independence has come up in a number of other contexts when we're talking about decentralization or autonomy or decision-making or even the OODA loop in a certain sense. And independence is a really tricky idea because maybe it's not even possible. And so the question that we're going to grapple with today is, what is independence? Is it possible? And is it desirable? Like, is that a thing that we should be shooting for, is to become independent? And then connected with that, because we have a sense of irony, is the launch of our Patreon-esque donor box that's attached to our website, where we are asking for donations in order to help support the channel, which seems to fly in the face of the idea of independence on one level and enhances it in another. And let's untangle that.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say that's actually pretty close to the way I would set it up, too. I really especially like the addition of not just is independence possible, but also is it even desirable?
Yes.
Right. Because, just approaching this question from the face, one possible conclusion we could come out with is, well, yes, it's absolutely possible, but it's totally a stupid idea, right? Or sometimes it's a stupid idea and sometimes it's a really good idea, right? Like, those are at least prima facie possibilities that could emerge from
for sure.
the discussion.
For sure.
And I also thought of precisely that same video too. Why make things for yourself to gain independence, right? And so I was actually thinking about this as I was driving over here today. I was like, well, I'm really happy taking the contrary position on this. That independence is an illusion or a mirage or a false goal in some sense, right? But then I started thinking, and I was like, but there's so many things that I do like doing for myself. So I'm looking forward to jumping into this because to me, it's a real question, right? It's a very real question. And, part of what makes a real question is you don't know the answer, at least not totally.
I've been doing a fair amount of writing on my own that's going to inform some of my argumentative positions on this issue. I've been outlining the basic structure for a book called How to Be Free, in which I just tackle and wrestle with these ideas of independence and whether or not it's possible and how much you can achieve it, blah, blah, blah. But my basic argument is that the process of becoming an adult, we start in this world as infants, and as an infant, you can't take care of yourself. You can't even control when you go to the bathroom. You have zero choices. And then as you become a child and grow into a teenager, you get more and more and more choices. You have more and more power, shall we say. Mm-hmm. There are more things that you can do. And with that comes more responsibility. Thank you, Spider-Man. And between this power and responsibility, in a sense, that's what it means to become an adult, is to gain both more capacity, more power, capacity, ability to choose, and more responsibility, mm-hmm. where you are the one who is responsible for your own choices. Mm-hmm. And in the legal system, we kind of represent this at a 18 cutoff date, where mm-hmm. after that point, you are criminally liable for your own actions. Mm-hmm. And we will hold you accountable for the choices you make. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can that's kind of an arbitrary date to say that you become an adult, that you have this independence or autonomy.
Why
or
not
responsibility.
18 in one day, 18 in a month, 19?
In truth, it probably is more of a spectrum thing where you can increase in capacity and responsibility, and in the same way that it is desirable to become an adult and to leave childhood things behind, mm-hmm. it is desirable to take on the extra levels and become a more capable, more responsible adult. Mm-hmm. Let's push toward. Let's say that it's like in calculus where you never actually get to the goal, but you get really close to the goal. And that goal is something akin to godhood.
Asymptotically approach
full power and full
ultimate,
responsibility.
Ultimate capability and responsibility.
Ultimate capability and responsibility, both of those together.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever builds those two, I would say, is a desirable thing. Now, whether you can get that, I mean, that's another question, but that's kind of the rough sense of where I'm coming from. And that seems to actually tie into an old video we did on a massive forging setup at the Black Country Living History Museum in England, where we were talking about this massive forge equipment and how that was noble to be engaged in something so monumentally huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, make like a gigantic, like 10-foot long steel anchor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't do that in the backyard forges we've built.
Mm-hmm. So, so one of the things that I want to point out before we even get any further and start talking about independence proper is that I really like the connection that you have drawn in describing this pathway from childhood to adulthood, right? The connection between choice and power and responsibility. And I mean, why not throw freedom in there? Because we often equate freedom with choices, right? Like if you're free, then you can choose between things.
Sure.
Right, in at least some simple sense. Right, so I really like the connection that you're drawing between those because, if you're 2 years old, it's not like you don't have the choice to make a souffle. And it's not because there's some mean person saying, you can't make a souffle. Instead, it's because, well, okay, so first of all, you're only a couple of feet tall. You can't reach the stove. You don't even know what a souffle is, much less how to make one, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like you don't have that choice because somebody is holding you back. You don't have that choice because, well, you're just not the kind of person who can make a souffle, right? You have zero of the... Well, I shouldn't say zero. You have very few of the mental or physical characteristics necessary to make a souffle. Right? And so, okay, so how do you get that choice? How do you get that freedom? How do you get, if you're 2 years old, the option to make a souffle? And the first answer is, well, you wait until you're like 10 or 12 or, can do this, right? But if you're 10 or 12 and can't make a souffle, right? Well, then, how do you gain that choice? How do you gain that freedom? And the answer is by increasing your power, increasing your capability, increasing your skill set, increasing your knowledge, right? In other words, it's by developing yourself, and then attendant with that, Spider-Man again, right? Attendant with that comes this great responsibility function where, and it's not just a legal function. Like in general, we just hold people responsible for what they do, right? And if they do something we don't like or that we think is wrong, then there will be consequences, even if that consequence is just, I don't want to play with you anymore, right? If you do something that other people don't like, they will punish you for that. They absolutely will.
Yeah.
And there will also be consequences, right? So, for example, if I never learn to make a souffle, then, well, guess who's not ever going to make a souffle?
Yeah.
So I really like the alliance between power, responsibility, and freedom. And that's a really interesting thing because I think that's something that's not always perfectly seen, is that a lot of the times we want the souffle without learning how to make the souffle. Or we want the souffle without incurring some kind of change on ourselves and without incurring some kind of responsibility. And so I just want to point out that there's actually like a really deep metaphysical model there, a really deep ethical model, right, which says, okay, if you want responsibility, that has to come with increased capability, and that has to come with increased freedom.
Yeah.
And if you want increased capability, if you want increased power, that has to come with responsibility, and it has to come with increased freedom. And if you want increased freedom, if you want more choices, more options, that inevitably comes with increased capability and increased responsibility, right? And we're positing, I'm assuming that's the way the universe works, roughly speaking. That's not a human creation, although there is a human or social element to it for sure.
Well, human enforcement. So the responsibility.
Well, but also not just purely human enforcement, because if I don't learn how to make a souffle, I cannot.
Yeah, that one is an inherent factor of the universe. So you can think of this as different types of constraint.
Although I can get somebody else to make me a souffle.
You certainly can, and maybe. A thing that we should probably probe into just a little bit later is whether that is the same as having made one yourself. Whether getting the mail order souffle, and maybe it's perfect, made by a 4-star chef.
Or having your brother or sister or mom or dad or spouse or significant other or whoever, your roommate, make you a souffle, right?
And whether that's the same
I
as
will
having made one yourself.
I will vacuum the floor if you will make the souffle. Deal?
Okay. Specialization. Specialization.
So division of labor is going to come into this too, right? Like we can see
Yeah,
everything is just like flowing right out. So
lots of material there, with limitations of. So one of the things that you mentioned is that it's not some mean person holding you down if you're 2 years old. And
I mean, it can be, but in the case of the 2-year-old, it's certainly not. Right?
No, in that case, it's physical, material, it's capacity. I mean, the child just lacks the capacity, and
no matter how many
desire.
eggs you give them, no matter how many pans you give them, they'll probably use the pans as musical instruments and smash the eggs all over the carpet.
Sure. Actually, that sounds about right. Funny enough. That idea actually reminds me of my son, who is 4, and he is right now grappling for his own soul. He is fighting for control of his own will. And so right now, the choices that he has are pretty limited. And part of that is, as parents, my wife and I have to have him actually make decisions sometimes. And he likes to linger in the moment where he has the choice and hasn't yet made the choice. And so he'll say, yes, no, yes, no, no, yes, no, and just kind of hold you in suspense. Which one's it going to be? But the other thing that he'll do is if I try to do things that he knows he can do for himself, he will scream and fight and claw and demand and really fight for ownership, moral ownership of that choice. The idea that I would go over his head and just do it for him is so unbelievably offensive to his 4-year-old sensibilities that I think that for one thing, I'm not an expert on child psychology or anything like that. I'm just relating what I have observed and some assumptions that I have about what I've observed. But one role that seems to play is you need to fight for your own soul in order to develop your own soul, in order to be able to, develop the capacity and responsibility to make choices. You have to have ownership of those choices. And you shouldn't tolerate someone else making the choice that is rightfully yours. I think that fundamentally, one of the very few things that people own, like true property, is ownership of a list of choices. It's not the stuff. It's the choices about the stuff. Anyway, so he's fighting for his own soul, and I find that fascinating because I think there is a moral struggle there, and I respect it. I respect that as an important thing. And who knows, maybe he'll listen to this in 10 years. But that would... I see that as an important thing. An important part of human development is fighting for your own soul to make choices. And I think a lot of being a teenager and, striking out and declaring independence from your parents even is part of that process where you are demanding the right to take final responsibility for some of your own choices, even if that means failing or struggling or having worse outcomes because it is somehow morally superior to own
This
the
is
choice.
my ship, and even if it sinks, it's still my ship.
It's my ship.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if you wanted to add anything onto that. So.
No.
Okay.
Take it away.
So, what I was going to do is, we've just said some wonderful things that I totally agree with, and now I want to take a wrecking ball to them. Okay. I mean, so here's one line of argument that you can follow out of all this, right? This is the wrecking ball that you can take to everything we've said so far, right? Or at least to a lot of it, right? Okay, so let's suppose that I am, I'm an adult and I will make my own dang souffle, right? Or maybe I'm a 12-year-old and I'll make my own souffle. Whatever. I'm going to make my own souffle, right? Nobody's going to make my souffle for me. Okay, well, so did you make the eggs? Well, first of all, you didn't make the eggs. The chicken made the eggs, right? Okay, well, did you raise the chickens? Well, no, you probably didn't. Maybe you did, right? But you probably didn't, right? Okay, let's move over to the spices. Did you grow any of those? Did you dry any of them? Did you process any of them? Do you even know what plants they come from? Right? Okay, well, what about the pan that you're making the souffle in? I'm actually a little embarrassed here because I don't think I've ever made a souffle. This is hitting a little close to home for me, guys. I think I may not be an adult because I've never made a souffle. But I think you make it in a pan, right? Let's pretend you make it in a pan. So if you make it in a pan, okay. Well, did you make that pan? Did you cast it or forge it? Did you dig the rocks out of the ground? Did you make the rocks? Could you have made that from the primordial hydrogen atoms that were floating around the universe after the Big Bang? Huh? Did you? Right. And so part of this, on on some level, you're like, oh yeah, like I made a souffle, right? I am so capable.
From scratch.
Yes, from scratch. And it's
nihilo.
like, okay, yeah, well, and did you even make the dang Big Bang, right? Like, did you make the hydrogen atoms, right? So the degree to which you can say, I am the souffle maker, it's like, I don't know, man. And maybe you think you're just hyper independent because you can make your own souffle, and you even raise the chickens, right? It's like, no, you're not. You're not the least bit independent. You're dependent upon every event in the whole history of the world, all the way back. No, not just the history of the world, all the way back, solar system, galaxy, universe, all the way back to the Big Bang.
Kaboom.
Right? You're about as independent as, like, I don't know. You're as independent as an animal living on the mountainside, right? Like, just because you can move around on the mountainside does not mean that you're the source of that mountainside, right? So there is my little diatribe against the concept of independence proper,
or absolute
against the possibility. Well, but I mean, I don't know how you can have relative independence, right? Like, I mean, there's something oxymoronic about that. Right,
well,
like your son is not saying, well, I want independence if that's okay with you, right? Because that's not independence.
Sure. So, right now, sitting in this booth, I am dependent utterly on oxygen.
Yeah,
I don't have that, I'm dead.
So there's another thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
And let's say I do raise all of the food that goes into the souffle myself. Yes. I'm still dependent on the weather and feeding my chickens.
Not being a giant earthquake.
Not being a war, not being a famine, not being a flood. I mean,
not getting struck by
I will always
lightning.
be constrained. Nature constrains. And so I think of choices as being like a menu. You have a list of options, and that list is finite, very finite. There's a range of things that you can do with the resources and circumstances that you have right now.
Or at least it's a limited infinity.
Which would not be infinity. So
you can have a limited infinity. So for instance, if you have all the odd numbers, you don't have any of the even numbers, but you still have an infinite number of numbers.
An infinite number, but with certain constraints that have to be met. Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I don't think that it actually is infinite. I think it's actually quite constrained. So you have a limited number.
I mean, purely mathematically, this is a real nerd point here, but like purely mathematically, right? If I can take one step forward, I can take half a step forward. And if I can take half a step forward, I can take a quarter step forward. And if I can take a quarter step forward, I can take a quarter plus a micrometer, right? And I can keep on slicing this down infinitely, right?
So even if it's
this is a real nerd point, but I just want to point out that there is an infinite number of choices.
Well,
not to mention that there's also choices we haven't even thought of yet.
Well, not really, because that generates paradoxes. That's Zeno's paradox. That's a very, very old Greek idea that you can subdivide something infinitely. But I don't think that's actually true.
I'm just saying mathematically it is true, because I can keep on adding. I can just keep on knocking the decimal down smaller. And I recognize this is a total nerd point, but I will stand by my nerd point here.
I am going to declare independence for mathematics and say no, there's actually a finite number, and I'll throw Gödel's proof as my supporting statement. So the idea, smack, Planck's constant, minimum unit of distance. So. Sorry about the nerd snipe. That was fun. The idea is that you have a limited number, it's like a menu, and that from this menu you must choose. Now, some activities will actually increase the size of your menu. And I think your menu actually changes size all the time. Like sometimes you have very few choices, and sometimes you have a whole bunch of choices, but it's always a constrained list. And so gaining what we call independence is about increasing the size of the menu, roughly speaking. And specifically, there's a particular kind of increase in the size of the menu that I think is really important, and that is to decrease the number of things that can destroy you based off of someone else's choice. It's to take a choice from someone else's bucket and put it in yours, if it belongs there.
Go on.
Okay.
You've just described an idea, so I want you to kind of
flesh it out.
Yeah.
An example: food. Let's talk about food. Let's talk about the homesteading movement, which is pretty big on the internet right now, of people wanting to grow their own food and do the smallholder hobby farm homestead thing.
Yes.
grow your own food.
Grow my own lettuce greens in the windowsill, at least.
Yes, own lettuce greens in the windowsill, at least. Food, not lawns, right? In this idea, if right now, with your menu of choices, which is funny that I'm using the term menu because we're talking about food, if someone else decides to not feed you, if, let's say, the price of food skyrockets because you're dependent on money to get your food, your steps for getting food right now are, I work, I get money, I trade the money for food. Let's say the price is quadruple. Well, that hurts you, and that's out of your control. That's someone else's choice. That's a collection of other people's choices, and you can't stop it, and you kind of need that food. So you have a responsibility to feed yourself, and now the choice for how to fill that responsibility has to go through other people. That doesn't make sense. And so maybe you could say that you have a natural right to control the food you eat, and someone else is exercising parts of this choice. Well, that's unnatural. That's not right. There's a moral authority and a right that you have to control that choice on some level. And I'm throwing this out there and trying to process the idea as I speak. So you start growing your own food. You, at that point, are not independent. You're dependent on the weather and the water supply and a lot of other things, and maybe you should try to get more independent of your water supply. Maybe that involves petitioning to allow for rainwater harvesting more than 3,500 gallons, as is in the state of Utah. But you are trying to get back choices that rightfully belong to you that are currently being exercised by other people. And so that's the idea. Is maybe independence only relates really to people, or it only relates to, well, even then I don't think that's true, because there's a material component. Like, you actually have to grow the food. You actually do have to exercise a certain amount of the choice so that you can have another choice, which is to eat the thing that you grew. What do you think?
Well, I like the idea of growing your own food, at least in principle.
Yeah. On an aesthetic level, I like it.
But I
I'm trying to
don't
figure out
like.
why.
I don't like the explanation, and here's why: is because it strikes me that it's much clearer to say in that situation, I think. And I also really like the idea about people not being able to hurt you by doing nothing, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. But I don't like the explanation, and here's why. Is because it strikes me as a much better explanation that you say, if I decide to grow my own food instead of buying my food from a grocery store, I'm not any less dependent on things outside of myself.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, depending on... Well, sorry, I'll leave that objection aside for a second because it appears a little specious. But what I'm doing, it seems to me in that situation, is I'm trading a better interdependent system for a worse. I'm trading away a worse interdependent system for a better interdependent system, right?
And so instead of more and less independent,
Yes.
we're just talking about more and less good.
Yes, and what's the goodness? Well, it's not independence because, at least this is the line of argument that I'm following here, because it's not independence because you're just as dependent, right? Excuse me. I mean, you're even just as dependent on people not breaking your window and stealing your salad greens, right? Now, I know you'll respond that that's not doing nothing. That's them actually taking an action instead of just hurting you by doing nothing, right? And I think that's a fair point, right? But you're still
dependent.
You're still very, very, very dependent. So I think what you're doing is you're trading out a worse interdependent system for a better interdependent system is the way I'm thinking about it. And then in my mind, the question is, okay, well, what makes that one better and the other one worse? And the answer is, I don't know. It gets me food better. There's psychological benefits. There's, I get a sense of, I get a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. I get a sense of pride and accomplishment from doing it. I don't know. There's all sorts of benefits, but the benefit is not that you're more independent. At least that's my conjecture here.
I like that. I think we're actually stumbling on an old Roman split in philosophy, which is the difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans. So the Epicureans, roughly speaking, are interested in outcomes. Outcomes are good or bad. Good health is a good outcome. That is a good thing. Being sick is a bad outcome. That's a bad thing. And so you measure outcomes and say if the outcomes are good or bad. And if we're looking at independence in terms of outcomes, in terms of an Epicurean model, you can't control squat. You can't control the weather. You can't control other people. Other people can totally break in and steal your vegetables and steal your stuff. And you have to sleep. And there's tons of stuff that you just can't control. And so if you're measuring it based off of outcomes and trying to become independent of all the things that could act on you against your will, then, well, totally worthless thing. So I think I'm approaching it mostly from a Stoic paradigm, maybe. I'm going to try this idea out and see if it sticks. The Stoics are interested in that divide. They say, okay, there's some things you can control and some things you can't control. The list of things you can't control is very, very, very big. So the only determinant, the only thing that says if something is good or bad is whether or not you chose well. And I'm going to use the word honorably for well. It's, did you respond with the limited choices that you have with the best one that you had at the time? And even if that leads to your death or your ruin or the loss of your health or bad outcome, XYZ, it was still the right thing to do. And so they're more interested in, did you do the right thing than did it have the right outcome? So they're in this land. Mm-hmm. And clearly when you're making choices, you at least have to think about outcomes. I mean, that's one of the things you're considering, right?
Phenomenologically, that's the way we experience choices, is we're like, I'll do A, and then, such and such conclusion will happen, or I'll do B and such outcome will
And so your choices are limited by your information, your ability to predict the future, which is really, really terrible, and, the constraints that you are operating under. Mm-hmm. But you're at least thinking about outcomes. But that's not what made the choice right. And I think my reclaiming agency idea has more to do with the idea that you actually morally own certain choices, that you are morally responsible for the outcomes or for the choices that are made of that kind, even if someone else made it. And so you need to get that choice back under your umbrella because it is your choice fundamentally. And an example of that, I'll paint kind of a picture. Let's say that you're standing on the high dive at the public pool, and you have been working up the nerve to jump off the high dive for 3 weeks. And you've climbed up to the top of that thing multiple times, and you're psyching yourself up. You are developing the courage necessary to jump off into the water. You're getting ready. You're psyching yourself up. And right in the moment, just barely before you were about to jump in, somebody pushes you, and you fall into the water. The outcome is identical. You fall off of high dive into water. But there is a feeling of moral affront, like, no, you robbed me of the courage of that choice by taking it from me at the last minute. That's roughly speaking what I'm pointing to, is that's what it would mean to reclaim your choices. And that action of the person who nudges you, even if it leads to a good outcome, is tyranny.
So I agree with your example, and I think I agree with you in principle, but I have trouble applying that model across a wider across a wider span of human decisions. And the reason why is because although I agree that other people shouldn't take your choices away from you, it's not. I don't know if sort of the originary factor, the absolute here, is which choices are yours. So, for example, if you're working on a team, you're accomplishing some task, it could be, a very complex task in a corporate environment, or it could be as simple as let's clean the kitchen, who's going to wash the dishes and who's going to put away the food and wipe off the table and sweep the floor and so forth, right? So, okay, to some degree, or at least, in normal human experience, some of those choices end up seeming pretty arbitrary, right?
Sure.
Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing is, let's include some kind of leader in this who's directing the actions of his subordinates, right? So let's pretend we have a ship, and I wish I knew more about ships, but let's run with the example. You have a ship, and you have, crew member X, and you also have the captain. And crew member X has such and such responsibility, and he doesn't fulfill that responsibility. He fails in that responsibility somehow. Let's assume that he had good intentions and that he tried, right? And for some reason, as a result of that poor decision, again, if I knew more about ships, I could create a more realistic example, right? But because of that poor decision, the ship sinks, right? And so the question is, okay, well, so who bears responsibility for this, right? Who bears responsibility for the catastrophe for the sinking of the ship? And you can start building, at least prima facie, right? before you know a lot of the particular facts, you can start building a pretty good case in favor of each, right? So presumably this crew member did something or failed to do something well in a way that caused the ship to sink, right? But it's also true that the captain he's the captain. He's ultimately responsible, isn't he? And if that crew member was should not have been chosen because they were incapable of adequately performing that responsibility. So perhaps the hiring screen was not that good, right? Or perhaps the hiring screen was okay, but he should have been educated better, right? Or perhaps the captain had a little feeling that he should have told the crew member about something but didn't follow through on that, right? But the crew member still did something kind of silly, right? Or something that he should have done better, or that somebody else could have done better, right? And so now I'll grant you that in any particular case the facts may skew heavily in favor of one or the other, right? Maybe the sailor was drunk as he performed his responsibility. Maybe he lied and cheated his way into the job, right? Or maybe the captain, was derelict in his responsibilities more clearly in some way. But my point is that in a lot of concrete cases, it's not going to be clear at all who should have made a different choice.
Yep.
Or both people should have made different choices. And so, it's very possible, right? Like maybe the captain should have had a better screening method, right, for hiring people. Let's pretend that the person should never have been in that job, right? They're not capable of executing their responsibilities. Perhaps the captain should have a better method for hiring, right? In other words, he's 100% responsible for this, right? And let's also suppose that sailor should not have tried to go for a job that he knew was above his scope of capability, right? In which case he is 100% responsible. In which case we have two people who are 100% responsible for what went wrong. We have 200% responsibility. You're responsible. Everyone gets 100% responsibility.
Sure. I like that. And I actually, one of the problems with this sort of theory is that it's impossible to apply, because issues of who has responsibility and who has moral ownership of a choice, which is responsibility, is really hard to untangle.
Or at least it can be. Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it seems a little clearer.
Knowledge seems to be an important component, like what you had, information you had access to at the time. Like if you should have known better is a thing that we ask.
Yeah.
In the law, they refer to two types of causation, two types of causes for a thing. One of them is but for causation, which is but for this, it wouldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. And that could be as simple as, that car that cut you off in traffic that caused you to be late. Yeah. If it weren't for that, you'd be fine. Or the famous poem about losing a horseshoe nail and losing the battle.
Although it's worth mentioning that even that car cutting you off is pure. I accept it as a legal standard, but what cracks me up about it is it's pure metaphysical speculation, because who knows that something else wouldn't have happened, right? Like there's so many metaphysical qualifications here. It's a total ceteris paribus. Like I look at that and I'm like, that is such a metaphysical cop-out. Right, but sure, it's a great legal standard. It's a decent legal standard.
But that doesn't assign responsibility.
It works in practice, but not in theory.
That's one of those. That's such a funny thing about the law. But for causation is the first type. The second type is called proximate cause, and that's just the legal term for the person who bears legal responsibility for the action. Mm-hmm. And you could have more than one but for causes. Mm-hmm. You could even have more than one proximate causes. Well, really, you need one. Like you need to assign the blame. The blame goes somewhere, and so that's that. And
which is the thing about law is at the end somebody has to pay up, right? Yeah. Somebody has to go to jail. Somebody has to pay.
Even if it splits out all these different ways, which leads to some unsatisfying answers. Mm-hmm. But we have to have answers, and that's what.
And perhaps sometimes an unsatisfying answer is a little bit better than no answer at all.
For sure. So that's a thing. One thing that I really like about what you were saying is that you liked the example that I used about the diving board. There seems to be something there. Mm-hmm. I'm going to use Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance as
praise be
pre-intellectual quality awareness thing. I mean, there seems to be something wrong there, and maybe the appropriate level for a discussion of independence isn't the theory. Maybe it's what you. Well, gosh. I need to be careful how I say this, because I don't know what I don't want to oversell it. Mm-hmm. But it seems to be that there is something better about growing your own vegetables.
Sure.
There seems to be something good about that. Something where it's like, it's satisfying. And what is it satisfying exactly? Maybe it's a deep human need. Maybe it's just you like working in the garden, and maybe it's just a meditative experience. I don't know. But there seems to be something good there. And then there seems to be something good about making the choice and having the satisfaction of having chosen to jump off of the high dive. And it was your choice and you did it. And I am ex post facto, after the fact, slapping an explanation on that's seeming to tie a bunch of these together. And frankly, it's not all that satisfying to me either. I'm still trying to grapple through this independence thing. And so 2 things that we can say with relative certainty. You're never going to be 100% independent. At the very least, you're going to be dependent on the weather, the political system, and whether or not your neighbor goes homicidal today.
Well, I would even qualify that as you are always 0% independent because there's always an infinite number of factors that could come in and ruin your day. But sorry, go ahead. Right, I think we all understand what you're saying, right? That you'll never be able to do everything you want. There will always be some kind of constraint on you.
Always be some kind of constraint. Some of that's physical, some of that's political, some of that's there's constraints. And you won't be able to control outcomes. And those are maybe 2 separate things. You always have to operate within constraints, which means you never have perfect godlike freedom. You also don't control outcome. But we do get the sense that you can increase in your capacity and responsibility. And those are not contradictions for some reason. So is it still a good thing to increase in capacity and responsibility? And I would say yes.
So if you don't mind, I'm sorry to monopolize things here for just a second, but I want to talk about 3 things, if that's okay.
Do it.
Okay, so the first one is I want to tell you guys about Audible. We advertise for Audible, and if you use our link, audibletrial.com/goodandbasic, then that helps to support us. I'm trying to think of any good books about independence on Audible. I'm sure you have a couple.
Oh, dear.
Don't you?
Yes.
I mean, the Booker T. Washington.
Oh, gosh, that one's amazing. Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery, is incredible. That one is an incredible one. It's basically about his role in... it's his autobiography told carefully to kind of focus on this aspect of how is it that he and others who were in a similar situation to him could lift themselves up from slavery, from the condition they were at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. So he was raised in slavery as a child and then worked in a coal mine when he was a young boy after being freed. And then he received a world-class education and then dedicated his life to teaching and founding an institution, the Tuskegee University, I think it's called now. It used to be called the Tuskegee Institute, and teaching. And he taught an interesting mixture of handcrafts, like industry, that was designed to create independence. And so that's a fantastic book. Another one that's kind of a funny one is called, it has 2 titles. In the UK, it's called Sow Your Own. And in the U.S., I think it's called Through the Eye of a Needle by John Paul Flintoff. And that's about this author's quest to try to figure out how to save the world. And eventually what he comes up with is sewing his own underpants. So it's a hilarious book.
That sounds kind of Petersonian, clean your own room.
Yeah, that's his thing. He starts taking responsibility and outsourcing less. At the beginning of the book, as an experiment, he outsources his entire life to a personal assistant who organizes all of his, basically everything. He outsources his entire life. And then over the course of the book, he starts claiming responsibility for more and more things until he decides to sew his own clothes. And that's the way that he tries to make the world a better place, and he takes some satisfaction out of that. So that one's a good one. I plan to do a more in-depth review of that one in the next month or 2. Maybe 3.
But you can get ahead of the curve by listening to it on Audible.
I believe so. And I hope it's on Audible. I did not listen to that one on Audible, but I hope it is. If not, then I need to talk to the author and ask if he needs a good narrator. But that's a good one.
So basically, we would love to invite you to become more dependent on Audible so that you can learn on Audible and become more independent. And that's a perfect example of just how tangled this mess is.
Well, one of the questions I ask with independence, and this is the thing in that video that we referenced right at the beginning about why make things yourself, and that is, can you do without? That's a question. Can I do without Audible? Yes. Yes, I can. I know how to read books. I can do that. I can read.
I totally want to retort that you don't print your own books, blah blah blah. But I'm
Sure.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to silence that part of myself because I've already made that objection like 3 times in this podcast.
Audible, specifically Audible. Can I do without audiobooks? Yes. Can I get the same benefits that I was getting from them, more or less? Can I do things at the same time? No, because audiobooks.
I was going to say, you can't
free
get
up
the
my
same
time.
benefits, because if you could get the same benefits, you wouldn't do it. Like Audible actually does, it provides me a really good service, right? It provides me something that I cannot get another way.
In economics, there's a term called fungibility, which is how well you can exchange one product for another. Like, are Coke and Pepsi fungible? Can you exchange the one for the other and have it be more or less the same? Mm-hmm. Some people will say yes, and other people will say no, they're not the same.
Mm-hmm. Whereas in almost all cases, so for example, an example of like pure fungibility is money, where $1 is just as good as another dollar.
Sure, and you can exchange the one for the other, and it's totally exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Or even one Coke can and another Coke can are pretty darn fungible.
And so we look at the difference between Audible and reading the book yourself, and there are differences. And the question is, are those differences so big that it's like a fundamental difference, or can we exchange the one for the other? And I mean, I read out loud to my family. That's a thing that we do. That's a fun family activity. Right now we're reading the BFG, which is great, by Roald Dahl. And I can do without. If I had to, I could sacrifice Audible. That having been said, I really like it. It's nice to be able to make things at the same time. My routine is different with it.
I could survive without internet, but who'd want to?
Sure. But the fact that you can is impressive.
So this actually leads in. Okay, sorry. There's a couple things here. So sorry. The second thing I wanted to say is libertarianism.
Sure.
Okay. So
which one?
So libertarianism. I think about libertarianism a lot. One of the reasons why is because I have some leanings that would definitely be called libertarian, right? And I think what's interesting is that even though the number of nominal libertarians is not growing, right, and perhaps there's good reasons for that, the number of people who have strong libertarians leanings is growing. In other words, the people who are like, you should generally be able to do what you want as long as you're not hurting other people, right? So here's the thing is, I used to be much more libertarian. And one of the things that stopped me from being so libertarian is I stopped and thought about it, and I was like, you want to know something that libertarians can't tell you anything about? They can't tell you anything about how to be friends with people, and they can't tell you anything about families. They can't tell you anything about any kind of human relation that isn't economic in nature.
Transactional.
Yeah, and I think they do an excellent job. Like I do have some strong libertarian leanings, and I won't talk about that right now because that's way too long to get into right now, right? Like trying to evaluate libertarianism or political philosophy, we cannot do that in the next 10 minutes. But this was one of the things that kind of maybe disillusioned me a little bit with libertarianism. Is I was like, you want to know something? They can't tell me anything about friends and family, and any life philosophy that cannot tell me about friends and family is deeply incomplete. It's deeply incomplete because humans are social. They just are, right? And everyone, we do not yet have a way to get babies born except for with a mother, inseminated by a father. Like these are kind of, and most people, are born in some kind of family situation, right? And so lots of people will form some kind of family situation later in life, right? And so if you can't tell me about that, then I'm like, there are some big gaps in your account of the world, right? So that's just an interesting side note that the fact that because libertarianism is also, I think, associated with independence quite a bit. It seems like a political philosophy that goes really nicely with independence, right? And I'm like, I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying, but there are huge gaps here that you're not explaining that somebody needs to explain. Right, you need some theory, you need some way of thinking about those things, and you're not telling me how to do it. So, that's a thing.
So, libertarianism, a book by, and this one actually is on Audible, by Laura Ingalls Wilder is the second book in her series. It's called Farmer Boy, and there is an argument at the end of the book. Basically, I'm going to spoiler warning this one a little bit. It's a great book, worth reading. Really good for kids as well, and most of the book is Almanzo being raised on a farm and talking about the various things that they do through the agricultural year. And it's fascinating hearing the descriptions about the way they plant potatoes and the way that they do baking day and the way that they do stuff. And it's actually really fun to hear about the way that they cut ice in the wintertime and the way they use that in the summertime to make ice cream. It's really, really cool. He gets an opportunity to get an apprenticeship with a wheelwright toward the end of the book. And if he does that, then there's a good chance that he'll be able to work his way up within the company, become the owner eventually, have made it financially. And his parents are appalled. They hate the idea. They were hoping that he would take over the farm. And their reasoning is really interesting to me. It's the wheelwright owner, the guy who makes these wagons, has to please people in order to eat. If he does not please the people, he can't eat. He is utterly dependent on his customers. He has to pretend to be friendly or be friendly. He has to.
How terrible would it to be friendly?
Oh no. But yeah,
I mean, most people think of friendliness as a pretty positive character trait.
And his father isn't some kind of troll hiding out in the woods saying, "I never want to talk to another person ever again." They characterize it in terms of honesty. Like, his dad doesn't have to be friendly to anyone that he doesn't want to. He is absolutely free. He owns all of his own food. He owns all of his own means of
but don't you
taking
think he
care of
misses
himself.
out on having a lot of friends he could have?
He has a lot of friends. He's a very prominent person in the community, big name in the church. Everybody talks to him at all the civic events. Like, he's a pillar of the community.
Well, then he's just being friendly.
He's being friendly, sure. But they characterize it as a difference between you have to please them in order to eat. Like, you're dependent on all these people that come in. And if you own the farm, then you're free and independent. And so eventually Almanzo chooses to be free and independent. That's the plot spoiler for the end. And I'm sympathetic to that idea.
So this leads into the thing that we haven't talked about
That
yet that I
having
want
been
to talk
said,
about.
If I had enough of a farm, let's say I have a robot taking care of it for me, to where I will eat at kind of a base level gruel level, no matter what anyone says. And then I run a wheelwright shop, and I'm friendly to everybody, and I sell my wagons, and I make money, and I'm doing well in the world that way. Then I don't see any problem, because I could cut off the wagon and still not starve to death. I'd be fine. As well, maybe there's like this base level that we need to meet, and then everything else is social. Like, there's a certain level of taking care of yourself.
Yeah. So this is the question that we have left aside that I want to hit briefly is, do you even want to be independent? Is it even desirable? Right.
Do you want to be an island? No.
And
because all the most satisfying things in my life
are
are responsibilities that I meet for other people.
Here's
everything that is satisfying.
Yeah.
And that's to my kids, to my family, to my church, to my community, to YouTube even. I mean, the idea that we're putting out useful content for you guys, that is a deeply satisfying thing. And all of the satisfying stuff has other people and responsibilities involved.
Which again is why I don't think libertarianism can ever be. I mean, this is my issue with libertarianism exactly, as I'm like, it's leaving out so much stuff.
But if I was dependent on all of this stuff,
well, you are. You can't get that sense of responsibility and fulfillment without other people.
Let's cut the responsibility out. I have responsibilities to myself as well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe let's just cabin it off at food and the power bill. It rankles me a little bit, and I kind of hate it and grapple with it inside if I feel beholden. Maybe that's a good word, beholden to somebody. And this is actually maybe a tie into the Patreon thing, to the idea of patronage. Because it seems to me that there's a difference if you have 5 patrons or 1. If you have 1, there's a thing called monopsony in economics. It's the opposite of a monopoly. In a monopoly, you only have 1 seller. In a monopsony, you only have 1 buyer. And so in that situation, let's say that I am Leonardo da Vinci and I'm working for 1 patron in Renaissance Italy. And that 1 patron, because he controls all of the money that I get, gets a lot of say over what kind of art I make. In fact, if I say things that are not
only
pleasing,
if you let him.
Only if I let him, sure, that's true. But, I need to eat, and so let's say my motivation and incentives are extremely unbalanced. I have been bought, basically.
Well, you decide whether or not you've been bought. But I agree that the structure it's a bad incentive structure. What you do with that incentive structure is a different question, but I agree it has a bad incentive structure.
You could maybe sacrifice self in favor of your art and say, no, I must be true to what it is that I'm going to write.
Or you could just say, look, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees.
Sure.
And you're like, look, I will make the art I want, and if you don't like it, then I'm okay not doing art anymore.
Sure, doing without. Being
making
able to do without. This is the John Boyd thing again.
Well,
the two ways to get freedom are to have so much money that you don't need to worry about it anymore, or to be so in poverty that no one can take anything away.
Here's the thing, though, is I think that I think it is better to live on your feet than to I think it is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. But I think that far better than dying on your feet or living on your knees is to stand with other people and dance in a circle with them. Like, I think interdependence actually is a higher goal than dependence, or than independence, right? I do.
I feel like independence is a precondition for interdependence.
And I mean, we could argue about this is what
minimum threshold. And
but I don't think it's a minimum threshold issue, right? I don't think it's a minimum threshold issue because I don't think that you're morally inferior if you can't raise your own food. I just don't. Like, I don't feel, I will not, there are millions of people in the United States and around the world, hundreds of millions of people who do not grow their own food. I don't consider them morally faulty because of that. Like, not by pure dint of that fact. Now, there might be other contingent factors that make it better for them to grow their own food. But, like, no, I can't do that any more than I can say you're morally bad because you didn't build your own car. You're morally bad because you didn't lay your own fiber optic cable for the internet. You're morally bad because you don't know CSS or HTML or JavaScript. Like, no.
I agree. Yep, not morally bad, but maybe...
And I don't think you're morally superior if you can build your own car or code your own website or grow your own food, except in the most abstract possible way. Like, I think it's the wrong level of resolution to handle the problem at. Because if I'm going to do that, then I have to morally judge everybody for all the millions of things that they don't know how to do, and that just seems like the wrong approach.
I don't.
I think it's morally wrong to not expand your capacity, perhaps. Right.
To stagnate or to not take advantage of your gifts.
But the fact that I'm going to learn to repair my own car means that today I'm not going to learn how to make a souffle. Right? Every single choice that I make to expand my capacity is going to be a choice to not expand my capacity in some other direction.
Which is opportunity costs in a nutshell.
Yep. I think I've pretty much said my piece. I think interdependence is I think the division of labor is great. I think interdependence is great. I think expanding your capacity is great. But I think you just have to decide, you know what, I'm going to be the kind of person, I'm going to learn how to repair a car and I'm not going to learn how to make a souffle. And guess what? I am okay with that.
I think that there is a major difference between looking at poverty and saying that poverty is it's a sad state of affairs, and a difference between saying it's a sad state of affairs and judging someone who is in poverty. I see the independence issue as being something like, if you are highly dependent, there's no judgment attached to that, but there is a wad of sadness attached to that. Like, it is a wrong thing for a human that could be independent to not be. It is a sad thing. It's like I'm judging the universe, not the person.
Hang on, independent or capable? Because I agree it's a sad thing for a human to not be as capable as they could be. But I don't know if I see capability as the same thing as independence. And part of this, for example, is capability.
In poverty,
capability
is a cage.
If capability and responsibility go together,
mm-hmm.
right? Then we often view constraints as the opposite of freedom, but I actually don't think that's the case at all. I think that's probably not the case at all. And in fact, it's an idea that's been floated around a lot that I agree with. That if you want to make someone creative, start constraining them. Right? You can't be creative with an infinite field of options. But if I give you 5 random objects, then all of a sudden you can be creative. Or think of a sonnet, right? If I just say write poetry, it's oh gosh, that's hard, right? But if instead I say, write poetry that rhymes, that has this meter, right? Then all of a sudden that gives you enough of a structure that you actually can be creative, right? So there is an idea that I agree with deeply that creativity requires constraint. I think in the same way freedom requires constraint. If you want to learn to make a souffle, you're going to have to discipline yourself and learn some rules of cooking. You can't make a souffle just any way you like. Now, there might be a lot of latitude and freedom, but you can't do it any way you like, right? Otherwise, for example, if you decide to make it with all the wrong ingredients, well, it's not a souffle anymore. It might be something else that's delicious. It's not a souffle, right? This is what Chesterton says about triangles, right? Like, don't go telling a triangle to liberate itself from its three sides, because if it liberates itself from having three sides, it will just cease to be a triangle. It's no longer a triangle at all, right? And so here's my issue, I think, with the word independence, is that it asserts freedom without responsibility. And I think that's clearly bad. But I think it asserts freedom without responsibility because it doesn't, like, the idea of independence is I don't owe you anything. And if you don't owe anyone or anything, then you don't have any responsibility. And I think if you don't have any responsibility, you also don't have any capability. And if you don't have any capability, you don't have any freedom. So I guess that's my 2 cents, and I want to hear your kind of sum up now.
There seems to be good kinds of dependence, or at least unavoidable, not in the cards to it. Gosh, how do you even say that? Don't owe anyone anything. Do I agree with that sentence? The independence is to say that you don't owe anyone anything. I guess it would depend on what you mean by owe. Because do I owe my children things? Yes. Yes, I do. I have responsibilities toward them. And some people do feel constrained by the home. That's a thing. I don't think.
Can I clarify what I mean by owe?
Sure.
So I don't necessarily mean like in a moral sense, but I mean to be constrained by, let's say.
I'm not bothered by constraint, I don't think. I'm bothered by unnatural constraint. And I'm going to make a comparison.
Yeah, but unnatural, like, what does that even mean?
The word discrimination, super horrible connotations. Discrimination is evil and awful.
We're talking about, like, obviously things like racial discrimination.
Sex discrimination, all this stuff. Discrimination. To discriminate means to differentiate and to treat differently. Mm-hmm. And do we discriminate? You bet your bottom dollar. Are there good kinds of discrimination? Yes. We discriminate
in terms of the strict definitional sense of the word, yeah.
We discriminate between people who murder and people who don't.
I mean, if you choose, like, whenever you go to eat at a restaurant, you choose one thing off the menu and not the other, you have just discriminated. In terms of the strict dictionary definition.
Strict definition. So in the law, we actually refer to invidious discrimination, meaning the bad kind. There is invidious discrimination, which is discrimination based off of something that you frankly shouldn't be seeing as a major difference. Things like race, where it's like, yeah, so you have a different amount of melanin. Let's discriminate against things that actually matter, like qualifications or, whether or not you stabbed somebody. Oh. So some categories of differences matter, and some categories of difference don't. And I think maybe there's invidious independence, like the kind that you can't. Like there seems to be a difference within independence. Like some independence is something that you really should be shooting for, and another kind of independence of trying to live as an island. I am a rock, I am an island, is not appropriate or desirable or good. And I do think that there is a kind that's good.
All right,
that's kind of a weird explanation. I mean, invidious discrimination as an analogy, but yeah.
I think this has been a pretty good slug-through session, and I think now it's probably as good a place to close as ever.
I don't think we're done with the topic, though. I think we might have to come back to this.
No, I mean, there's some things I still want to say, but we've already run to an hour. So, okay. Well, thank you all very much for listening. We hope... I don't know. What do we hope? See, I don't actually hope. I hope that you're more independent and dependent, I think. I hope you're more capable. That's what I feel most comfortable saying. I hope you're more capable because of this podcast.
I hope it's been worth your time.
So thanks very much. We'll see you next week.